Eric, you know what is one of the things I appreciate the most about our podcast that we do together?
No.
There's too many to name, but one that I have found myself thinking about after doing this episode is the fact that we managed to shoehorn the shit we want to talk about into any conversation. So I'll give you an example. Dr. Mel brought up video games. Immediately, I started talking about Dark Souls, which is one of my favorite series of the last 10 years, which was very applicable to everything that was said. Same with you. We're talking. I forget what we're talking about. You're like, that's like Muscletown, USA with Bob Hoffman. I'm like, yeah, hell yeah, bro. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, we have guests on mostly just to be a foil for us to say what we're going to say anyway.
Yeah.
Like, when you can say, we've got a theme through Iron Culture discussing the habits of bodybuilders when they lose and how they conceptualize that. And you're like, yeah, you managed to talk about that in the periodization for strength episode and also the behavior change episode. I don't feel like these episodes are adequately titled.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, Eric, what's fantastic about that? We are the silent hand that is guiding the cult, obviously. So we bring up the things thematically that we think are relevant.
Yeah, I mean, you characterize it as the silent hand. I would characterize it as the annoyingly loud person talking in the movie theater, and they won't stop talking about video games and bodybuilding while you're trying to watch a movie on something completely different. But basically, I agree.
But with that being said, oftentimes, if it's a bad movie, not that there's any bad movies here, the individual that's being loud can make it better, where they can make it more enjoyable. I mean, and then you even focus on said two individuals that prove to be indispensable for your entertainment because what you thought you were going to watch is far less entertaining. Just food for thought.
Hey, and you know what? I'm gonna throw an obscure reference out there. Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Right.
There's a reason why that was a popular show. And by popular, I mean some people liked it, including me.
Right.
So, there you go.
People with a great taste enjoyed it. And maybe that brings us to our guest, because I find in guests in general, we have great taste. And we were quite fortunate to have someone that got, a little PhD in neuroscience, talking about habits, talking about behaviors, talking about the intention gap. We have Dr. Mel on to really anchor this conversation that looks at essentially why do some people fail at some of the goals they have, and what can we do about it in order to actually achieve said goals.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really cool episode because sometimes people position the difference between the general pop and athletes as though they're these completely two different animals, like living in different environments and ecosystems and planets. But in reality, like, we're all humans. We just have different goals and we have different barriers to those goals. And the question of what is optimal is a question that largely is futile, in my opinion. Because what is practical? What is the best I can do with the constraints of me, who I can become, who I think I can become, and the environment I'm in, and my agency to change that environment is the real question that needs to be answered. And if you are attempting to answer a question that doesn't exist, what is optimal, you often set up goals and a plan to get there that are simply not going to happen. And that actually degrades your self-efficacy over time. So we get a really cool insight into some of the ways to deal with that, plan for that, account for it, incorporate it into the plan, and some of the internal looks you might have to take with Dr. Melissa Davis. And this is the first time she's been on, so it's an honor to have her.
Yeah.
Like Omar said, she's got a PhD in, I think, neurobiology and behavior. And not only that, but she's also definitely an experienced lifter. But more importantly, she's I think a multiple-time Masters world champion in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And yeah, she's got experience with different sports as well, physique competition, and works with a lot of clients. So she's a really perfect person to be talking about this, both as a researcher and an athlete and a coach.
No, absolutely. I think there's going to be a lot for every individual listening to this. I only wish that we were more effective with our marketing, where we released this, Eric, at the start of 2020. So the new year, new me. And we had some sort of catchy title, like what's really holding you back? But it's a February episode. I'm going to assume it comes out in February. And it's still relevant. Hey, if you fell off the wagon, it's even more relevant because we're going to help you get right back on.
Yeah, this is perfectly planned. We release this at the point people are just falling off of their New Year's goals.
Yes.
So turn in for this New Year's Failed Resolutions Fix episode that we definitely planned in advance with Dr. Mel Davis.
Yeah, fantastic. You need to stop doing this, Eric.
I mean, I don't know 100% what you're referring to, but I feel guilty right now because I feel like
Good.
maybe you're aware of what I did this morning.
Well, if a man could be considered to be guilty for what goes on in his mind, then I'm going to be guilty for all my future crimes. What I'm referring to specifically here is bringing a guest that's informed about something, and you're trying to change me, and it's not going to work. You got to stop doing this. Where you said, Omar, you can change your behaviors, and I said, I am who I am. Accept me for who I am, and then you bring someone on. Once again, we had, what was it? Lauren Conlon talking about, who is a great coach, talking about, meal plans versus macros, and talking just essentially coaching individuals and how to customize that coaching. I see what you're doing, and you need to stop. You're stuck with me.
Well, look, I like the great movie, but the Stuck Together, that is, just to clarify. Those who are aware.
We're going to be in the sequel, FY. That's what we're pitching to Hollywood, Eric. You best believe.
I know it's our back option pivot if Iron Culture doesn't work out is to get rights to the second movie. But Omar, basically, I know you've got this plan for how you're going to be a champion bodybuilder, and that's you're the one man pushing forth to create the division tailored for you.
Yeah.
And I just feel like that's less realistic than perhaps actually changing your diet and going through a contest prep like all other competitive physique athletes.
So you just want me to be like everyone else instead of be like myself. Dr. Mel, what do you think about the concept of a new division called the Body Wellness Division, where you just get on stage and you win because everybody wins, and you only say positive things, and because there are only positive things to say, and so everybody's a winner.
Yeah, I hate to be a voice of dissent, but I'm a big fan of meritocracy. And I feel like the body wellness division doesn't really give you anything to quantify. Maybe you could also supply your daily diet, and if it was a very health promoting diet, you could win by virtue of good eating for longevity.
I saw his spirit started to rise, and then when you said provide a diary of the diet, you just saw that crestfallen look for him. So I'm glad you're giving him ideas, and I know that he'd be very willing to change his behavior if it required no behavior change. So I think that's a perfect segue.
Alone.
Yeah.
No, he's absolutely not alone. I think he is
feel
alone
alone
in house. Yeah. Well, that's kind of the story of your life. And in the end, we are actually all alone. But we're going to pretend we're not so that we don't have existential dread creep into our lives from all angles. But I think Omar is unique, not alone, I will say this, in how contrasting your willingness to change your behavior is with the extremity of your goals, which I think is impressive. And if there was a division for that, you'd win it.
Eric knows how to get to my heart. You won me over. I'm ready to do this podcast.
All right. Awesome. Well, first off, Dr. Melissa Davis, it's an honor to have you on. For those who don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, you have a doctorate in neuroscience and behavior?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And I've heard you're a decent athlete. I don't know, like multi-time Masters BJJ champion of the world. I want to be the guy who announces in the ring, but I think I just overlooked
the really sweet thing about the Masters World Championships is that the medals say World Master, which pleases me.
Wow, that's amazing. So you didn't quite get to be the hegemon of the globe, but at least you have a medal that you could kind of remind you of your original goals when you first set out. I love it. I love it. All right, so Dictator of the World, Mel. We would love to talk to you more about the disconnect between what we actually know is the physiological roots of getting to some goal, whether that is fat loss, muscle gain, strength, etc., improved performance, and the barriers that truly become the problem. It's not the search for optimal, I couldn't achieve my goals because I was only 95% optimal, which we can't even know to be the case. But really, it was that we never uptook the behavior in the first place. And I think even though the iron gamers, the iron culturists, the cultists who listen, think that, if I just have the information, I will do it. I think if they're honest with themselves, they go through periods of hyperfocus, lets them some things slide, and then just kind of only think about when we're at our best and make that kind of what they report to their friends. I know I've done that.
Right.
Most bodybuilders don't want to talk to you about what happened in the 2 months post-show. Yeah. Their diet is everything except that, and I think that that's something that if we all look inward, we could admit. And it's probably, therefore, some of the lower hanging fruit that we don't consider in our kind of very, very machine-like focus on what is optimal. So
yeah.
Long segue, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a cool review, the name of which is escaping me, but I can give it to you later on if you want to put it on the podcast page. They kind of just went through a bunch of different studies that had assessed people's intentions about starting healthier behaviors, like going to the gym or eating better or losing weight and things like that. And they compiled them and did a systematic review of how many people follow through with that over a year time period. And it was something like less than 49%. I don't remember the exact statistic, but it was an appalling number for all of the people who stated, this is my intention to do this year. The number of them that even started, not that they achieved it, but that they even like got a gym membership, like ate well for a month, was less than half. So that's sort of startling. And I think we all can relate to that when we think about goals we've had over our lives, and how maybe we get excited, even the most motivated of us get excited for a week or two and dive in, and then it sort of falls off. And the technical term for that is the intention behavior gap. So you have these intentions and motivations, but your current habits aren't in line with making those changes. So your behavior doesn't get altered because habits are so much easier than intentional changes, intentional behavior.
So the intentional behavior gap is kind of that blind spot, I think, for a lot of people. And I think like I just want to emphasize even more how much this is almost the problem in health and fitness. Like it's such a known quantity that it is worked into the economy of fitness, and it's worked into the research in fitness. So for example, if you've ever read a study where there's the like intent to treat and like there's specific categorization of, okay, so here's people who completed the study. We got completers, but here's people who actually completed it per protocol, which is basically saying we have to set up our statistical methods just to take into account that most people aren't even going to do the shit we ask them to do.
Exactly.
You know, which is pretty crazy to me. And then I think the one that probably anybody can relate to, even if you've never read a study, is just that if you were to really get down to the heart of it, if you look at the big box gym model, they'd prefer you to have membership and not come in.
Right.
Most gyms actually could not handle all of the members if they showed up on the same day, you know? And like if you show up, you're going to use the equipment. That costs maintenance. They have to have staff. They'd much rather you just pay and, you know, feel like you did something, be there maybe the first 2 weeks of January, and then sit at home feeling guilty. Because as we know, shame is the best motivator for change, which I'm sure you're going to talk to us a lot about today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that not only just in lay people populations, like people buying those gym memberships and not showing up, or, you know, your local soccer mom who wants to start a diet and never does, but people who are really the more dedicated still struggle with taking those extra steps. Like, as you guys are well aware, you know, the longer you've been training, sort of more work and precision and consistency it requires to continue making progress. And I think even people who do a really good job in their habits get stuck when they know the details they need to change to take them that next level when they're very advanced, and they just can't seem to force themselves to do it, no matter how many podcasts they listen to or how many books they read or how many webinars they watch.
Yeah, that right there felt like a personal attack when you said no matter how many podcasts they listen to. I just want to provide a counter narrative to you guys, saying that, you know, gyms depend upon individuals not going. Maybe I buy a gym membership because I don't want to go, but I want to support my local business, you know? Maybe I want to support unfettered corporate capitalism. What's wrong with that, Dr. Mel?
Humanitarian, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
I actually think we owe an apology to everyone who's out there supporting their local gym by buying membership and not joining. So hats off to you for supporting the fitness industry.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I would love to hear, because, you know, some people, they'll look at, oh, you're a Masters World Champion, and they feel that somehow diminishes things. I actually feel the complete opposite, because I know, having worked with many athletes as they go through their progress, it's not just about like, oh, I'm old and I can't adapt well. Like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. What I know is that most Masters athletes, regardless of how they compare to the field or which field they're competing against, they're butting up against the ceiling of their own capabilities. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes an incredible amount of focus and willingness to try new things which gets harder and harder when you've built all these cumulative years of experience. You know, I personally feel like, you know, just in my goals as a strength athlete, I have to kind of sometimes force myself to really reconsider, because I've been training the same way, not the same way, but broadly the same way for 15 years. And if I don't progress, I have to get vulnerable. I have to assess my shortcomings. I have to see what are the aspects that I have always poo-pooed and thought weren't important. But now, like if I've only got 5% left to improve, maybe I need to start improving those little 5% pieces that are left and what I have agency over. So I'd love to hear, how does your own research into behavior and your own awareness of this field and its importance and that gap, how has that informed your own progress as an athlete, especially as you've gone into the later stages of your career?
Yeah, I actually started jiu-jitsu as a master's athlete, so I don't even have any reference point for being a non-master's athlete. But I think that particularly, especially for master's athletes, very often they are people who have careers, kids, families, sort of other things they have to focus on. And I think people like that, more than, you know, a 22-year-old who is living at home and training every day, more than that guy, they have to have really careful schedules, careful habits, and it takes a lot more structure to be able to get in the training and progress. So I think that developing good habits and strategies for reaching goals is even more important for most masters athletes.
And I imagine just advanced athletes in general, people who are closer to the ceiling. Yep.
Yeah.
That is, Eric, an interesting conversation, though, in terms of the differences between an individual that will choose to take up a sport later on versus early on, where we could talk about the total talent pool that's inside and what needs to be done to try and be a world champion. And what I mean when I say that is actually at Fortis Fitness, shout out to the gym I go to, shout out to Sean Kelly, there's actually a handful of masters athletes, so individuals that are 40 plus, that's the distinction in powerlifting, some in their 50s. So Neil's one, Peter's another, Sean's actually another. So we're talking ages 50 to 65, and besides Sean jokes and says he essentially waited his time until he got old enough where everyone dropped off, and so he became more competitive, and then he started winning because he's out of all five that I would list, and then Nanette from the female division, she's crushing it. But Sean's the only one that's been lifting for life. You know, the other ones, it's a new acquisition, a new hobby, and they've been able to dominate it. They come in and I speak to all of them. Like Peter as an example, he's a chemist. He just does his thing. And then his daughter started lifting. And then he thought himself, you know, he's almost 60. He's like, you know, I'm going to do this just for my own benefit. And then he took a Canadian record is what he did. Because once again, competition was a little bit lower. But I'm wondering what the difference is. Maybe, I don't know if it's the sheer amount of athletes, like the scalability of these things, where let's say, you know, if you have to train, in other words, if you have to train 10 years to attain some sort of goal versus maybe 2 to 5 years, how does that change? Or even the type of people that enter, let's say later on versus earlier on. Like you just gave the example of a 22-year-old athlete versus like maybe, you know, a 54-year-old or a 64-year-old.
You calling me 54? I'm just kidding.
Ooh. Oh.
Yeah, it's 30 plus.
Let's just say I was really excited about doing Olympic lifting this year, and then I signed up, and I remembered that Masters is 35 and over, and I got a little less excited because I was thinking in powerlifting terms and bodybuilding, and I thought I got another 3 more years before I'm a master. But hey, that's fine. It's all good. I don't care. I'm virile. I'm young.
He's unperturbed, folks.
Straying off the like habits and goals topic, but it's kind of interesting sport to sport what masters athlete means. Like for strength sports, for example, a lot of times, particularly for women, masters is going to be a scarier division, right? Because you have women who they don't have a testosterone drop off and they've just had longer to accumulate muscle and strength. So there's kind of like the peak and drop for that is different. Jiu-jitsu is interesting too, like particularly for the men, just because men have been sort of in it longer. Like the masters divisions for men have like these guys who've been doing jiu-jitsu for like 30 years. And it's almost in some ways a scarier division than the adult, particularly for the men. But yeah, it's interesting how those dynamics play into sport and what age you get into it and what age you can excel at it.
Yeah.
Sorry
You
for
heard-
tanking.
No, that's cool. I was gonna say, you
We're
heard it
all
here
about
first.
tangents here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You heard it here essentially first. Find a sport and find the age category you can dominate in it, and just bide your time. You know, it might be more competitive. Maybe it might be less competitive. You never know. And that's actually, Eric, that's a funny just topic in general when it comes to powerlifting and how much more competitive once again as the talent pool has dramatically increased. I remember the numbers like the Canadian so-called record in 2012, so 8 years ago versus now, how it's gone up basically every single division. It's gone up at least 10 to 20%. Is a safe number to say. Like it's gone up a shocking amount. So if you want to be this conversation is less the tension gap and more biding your time for the right moment.
Right.
And finding weakness wherever you can in whatever sport you can, and being a champion by any means necessary. I mean, Daniel LaRusso and the Karate Kid. Some might say that he won that, and it was only the All-State Valley Karate Tournament of '84, but to him it was a world tournament, and he won that thing.
That's right.
Framing.
That's right.
We talk about framing a lot.
Mm-hmm. So let's. I think where the I think the interesting thing is that a lot of people who are trainers, or when they view themselves as athletes, their identity is wrapped up into being athletes. It is part of what they do. They then do some form of that in the gym. And I remember I was victim to this mentality as well, was that I didn't think about forming habits. I thought about just doing it.
Right.
You know, I was a big fan of Nike, apparently. And I had no skill with how to tell someone else looking in how to do that if they didn't have an identity as an athlete or that. And I think my ego-driven belief was that all this came down to willpower. You know, that people who are bodybuilders, people who are powerlifters, people who are athletes or high performers in any field, business, whatever you can think of, they do what needs to be done on a regular basis because they're focused, they're hard workers, et cetera, et cetera. Is that an accurate viewpoint? And go ahead.
I don't think so. I think that willpower is obviously an important characteristic, and it's very valuable in sport training. But when you think about, and I don't want to get in trouble with other neuroscientists when I say this, but so the areas involved in habit formation in the brain are the same areas involved in addiction. And I'm not going to say that good or bad habits are necessarily comparable to addiction, but the same areas are involved. So it's sort of the same underlying process, even if the strength is different. So when you have let's look at addiction for a second, right? Is it just willpower that gets people to quit? Very often it takes a lot more than that. People have drug interventions and, lifestyle interventions and all kinds of like psychological therapy and things like that to quit drugs. And I think habits are a similar thing. Willpower gets you so far, but you're not going to end a bad habit unless you replace it with a new habit in reality. You're very rarely going to just end something without replacing it first, even if you replace and then end the replacement. I think that's the better strategy. And I think, like I said, willpower is obviously important, but making a consistent effort to develop a habit, the habit takes over, and then you have your sort of willpower resources for other things. If you're using your willpower for all of your goals all the time, you're just going to burn out. But if you can turn a lot of those into habits, then you get your willpower resources kind of back, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does make sense. And I think there's a couple really interesting things there, like 12-step programs in general. The key element is acknowledging that they frame it differently depending on the organization, but saying, I don't have the willpower to simply just take care of this. So I'm going to have this group-based support. I'm going to show up at meetings. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to go through these 12 steps. It's an active process rather than just simply actively trying to have the lack of something. You're actively engaging in a community and doing this and saying, I can't do this just with willpower alone. Right. And ironically, that's kind of the interesting inversion, is that it gives someone the power to beat an addiction more often than some other alternatives.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Omar.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's interesting how we tend, especially in the fitness side of things, to over glamorize maybe willpower. Let's just use that loose term. Where we want to believe we're self made individuals, ignoring all the advantages that we have, the systems we set up, the support structure, like the social support structure, all these various things that set us up for success. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Mill, but it seems like when it comes to overall habit formation or just trying to succeed at something, tipping kind of the cards in your favor from a multitude of different ways, forming the proper habits or all the variables outside of just, yeah, dog, let's get after that willpower makes a lot more sense than for some reason we have that illusion that the individual that's beset on all sides by obstacles, it's more noble than the ascension that they have. So we kind of have it often I've seen with lifters that mindset where it's like, oh, like it's everything's against it. Like you see the powerlifting posts that we encounter, like it works out into this shitty soap opera, like came in today, was feeling like crap. I'm like, wow, like you're already preconditioned, like felt like crap today, weights, warm-ups weren't moving great, missed the bus getting here. Pre-workout only had half a scoop. Didn't let that bother me. Still worked up to this. I'm like, what? Like, dude, whoa, this is a big narrative. But yeah, I'm curious. Then, how do we stack the deck in our favor if we acknowledge first that maybe willpower, however that nebulous term that we define, and we all kind of know what we're talking about here, is just one component. So, what are the other things that really add up to allow us to succeed in the things that we want to pursue?
Yeah, so kind of the structure that I like to follow or give to my clients is first, identifying your goal. I think that the other side of the problem is with achieving goals is that people choose goals that aren't reasonable for their lifestyle or their constraints, things like that. So when they don't sit down and write down like what sacrifices and changes are going to have to be made to reach that goal, they just like plow into trying to get there and fail and lose motivation and go through this sort of cycle. But if you kind of sit down, and I always tell my clients, don't sit down and make your fitness goals when you're like sipping champagne in the hot tub, because you're going to have a ridiculously out of touch idea of how much suffering you're willing to endure when you're very comfortable. Maybe like on squat day, when you've just done like 5 by 10 in the squat and you're laying on the floor in the gym, then decide how many things you're willing to sacrifice, how much work you're willing to do, and set your goals from that perspective so that you don't end up just missing. Because the more you set a goal and miss it, the less you're motivated, the less you believe that you can do it, and your self-efficacy goes down, and it's just not productive at all. So first step, identifying a goal that's realistic by walking through what sacrifices need to be made. And then second step, now that you've identified those, like the sacrifices or how many training sessions or what kind of things you need to do, building a very set schedule and a very clear plan for how to make that happen, and then setting that in action. I always tell my clients just 2 weeks. If your plan is to work out, train, 5 days a week, pick specific times to work out, specific days, never change those, build your meals, do that for 2 weeks. And almost always if they do, it just is easy after that. If they can get through the 2 weeks of adherence to their specific plan, it starts to become habit and they can actually make it happen.
That's really interesting that you talked about the current state you're in when you're creating your goals. And I was just thinking about like, the saying we always say is like, don't go grocery shopping when you're hungry.
Yeah.
I mean, it's because humans we have this kind of inability to really predict how we're going to feel, or even sometimes to reflect. And I think this is exacerbated by the modern society where we don't do as much reflection on like the variety of emotions I have had over time. That's one of the things I actually really like about bodybuilding, because there's a point in prep where you're like, I'm a really freaking different person right now. And that repeated experience, it at least personally, it helps me realize just how crazy I can be. And, I think I think the recovery diet versus reverse diet thing is a great example of people just forgetting what it's like. You're in the middle of prep, you're doing everything you can to get diced out of your mind, you're controlling every macro, and you're like, well, it'll be very easy for me just to go to protein and calories and increase by 500 and drop my cardio out. That'll be great.
Right.
And then you actually get there and it's like,
you're like, oh,
I couldn't
God.
not eat 10 donuts, you know? So, and if we think about what is the, typically the barrier to success, it's getting off the wagon. right? It's that initial
Yeah.
thing that then turns into the habit of not doing something or not following your goals. So if you can establish, which I love that you said this, if you can establish goals, an action plan, and a schedule in a state where you're feeling beat down, and that seems reasonable,
Right.
that means that probably when you're in that state and beat down along the road, which typically would derail you if you had these really high, goals exactly,
Yeah.
you'd probably be able to weather that storm.
Yeah.
Which I think is just a really interesting perspective. Is that kind of how you frame it for your clients? Or?
Yeah, typically. And I guess an additional caveat, particularly for working with less advanced sort of fitness clients, is the stepwise function of goals. Like if you haven't worked out or dieted before and you come to me and say you want to do a physique show, I'm going to just tell you no. You can't, going from having zero fitness habits to having enough fitness habits to get on stage and have it be reasonable is just, it's too big of a change. It's not very common for people to make that kind of change and that kind of alteration in their habits. And if they do manage to pull it off somehow, very often they've done it in a way that makes anything they've learned unsustainable, and the rebound is even worse. So, and then a sort of side tangent to that, I think, is the process to getting to your goal should have basic principles that will still support the sustenance of that goal, if that makes sense. So, for example, for a diet, if you just, cut out all bread and all, of your favorite cheese or whatever it is, and that's the basis of your caloric deficit, when you switch back to maintenance, you haven't developed any kind of basic habit that will support maintaining your weight loss.
Look, that's super awkward because we're actually endorsed by the carnivore diet, but we'll let that one slip. I do think there is an interesting pathway that I want to go down. If you're willing, I understand, maybe if it's outside of the scope.
Is it the
this
snake diet?
conversation.
Because I'm not willing to go down that pathway.
We're in current negotiations.
We're not going to go down that gullet.
Not yet. But if you were, we'd be swallowing it just whole, the entire body, because that's what a snake does.
Like a rabbit.
Now, I have often said that competence builds confidence, and I like what you said, where you want to try and select something when you've been humbled. Unlike the person I saw at the gym at Untamed Strength, no joke, this guy, he's a nice guy, but he went to go for a deadlift PR based on everything else being and he yelled, "The record is mine," before he started pulling it. And that's once again just the confidence that kind of going into that, the accumulation that was well beyond his ability. And he just stopped like halfway up, and the schism between what he thought he was and what his current abilities were, fantastic. But I do, because I would say, Eric and myself, I would identify that we're highly motivated individuals when we want to accomplish something. And I think if we want to circle back to those individuals, when you said, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, correct me if I'm wrong, but some people, when they try and achieve goals, they're unrealistic, and they kind of set up a negative pathway where it's like, I'm at point A and I want to go right to point Z, and I try and do it every single time. I fall off the wagon, and I'm never really able to gain some of that momentum. I'm never able to overcome that inertia. Can you just talk specifically in those individuals, or maybe how those negative pathways develop, or those reinforced negative beliefs? Like for those individuals where it's like, I can't even, like Dr. Mel, that 2-week start period, you're saying once you start the car, it's going to be great. And they're nodding their head. It's like, my car won't start, is there anything else in terms of like tips or perspective, framing, different things individuals can do just to get, from that 0 to 1, as they talk about?
Yeah, so there's like a couple tips, and we'll reluctantly call them tricks, but things like, so habits like addiction are cue-based, right? So if you just decide, say you have an open schedule, you don't really have a normal work schedule, and you just decide, I'm going to lift at 1 o'clock every day. That's not as good if you haven't done that before as saying, I'm going to lift after I pick my kid up from school, or I'm going to lift after I do some other thing that's already a habitual part of your life. Because if you can link the new habit to an existing habit, your acquisition is going to be faster. So that's one of the sort of little tricks that I give people when they're trying to add new things to their life. I also like to, if people are really struggling, like I've recently had a couple clients who are really struggling to lose weight. They're kind of new to fitness, and they're adding training to their life and like a structured diet for the first time, and just really struggling. I just take it down to one new habit. Like, forget about what you eat whatever you want. Let's get you in the gym 4 times a week. And once that's good, once that is a normal part of your life, let's structure the diet a little bit. And then once that's comfortable, eating, 5 times a day, let's actually worry about what's in those meals. And so just sort of taking these stepwise additions to changing your habits can be really helpful when people are having trouble getting over that hump, because maybe that hump is just too big for them in their current state.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
No, you go ahead, Omar.
Oh, look at this teamwork right here. Oh, you stop it. It's been said that it's actually very uncomfortable for the guests that we have on, just the relationship that myself and Eric have. But I just want you to know it's inclusive. We're not excluding anyone with our bromance, but it exists. It is what it is.
I don't know if you guys have met Mike and James, but I'm fine with this.
I have.
Yeah, that's it. Eric, what do you say? Are we above that level, below it, at it? What do you think?
It would be hard to be below it.
Okay.
We're definitely cuter. I would say that in the way we interact.
I didn't want to say that, Eric. I'm glad you did, because I could agree wholeheartedly. I don't even know how James looks like. And really, Mike, I'm just comparing 2 people with PhDs. I'm like, I thought
interactions are definitely less sweet, more risque, I'd say.
Well, there's a tenderness. What I like, we approach this with a tenderness, Eric, that is just beautiful. Now, I will say...
Exactly.
Yeah. I will say, for those individuals that are able to overcome that initial inertia, can you talk about maybe the concept of introducing fragility, or let's say variability? So... what I've often seen is someone builds a temporary habit. So it's a new thing, like new year, new me, and they're kind of on their shit and things are moving pretty good. But as soon as a large variable changes, so I'll just give an example. I sprained my ankle. So I overcame that inertia. It was hard for me and I did it. Now I can't go to the gym. Something has interrupted kind of my process and my frame, and now it's impossible for me to get back on. So can you talk about the concept of anti-fragility or developing robustness when it comes to sustaining these habits? So okay, we've talked about the person that wants to overcome it. They're kind of like, once again, new year, new me, things are looking good, but they're once again kind of fragile, where anything that perturbs kind of what they have might cause a disruption in the system. Where do we go from there? Like, do we intentionally try and introduce variability? What would you say for those people?
I think the best thing to do is when something like that happens, whatever the habit that is prevented. So say like when people get injured in jiu-jitsu, a lot of times they'll just stop coming to the jiu-jitsu gym completely. And I don't think that's helpful. I think that whatever the time was that you always trained, keep that allotted to something training related. So like come to the gym and watch people train jiu-jitsu. Maybe if it's, a regular lifting gym, maybe either go watch people lift or spend the time reading about lifting or recovery strategies, or doing, if you have PT, do your PT at the gym that you usually go to instead of doing it at home, so that you still have the habit of driving to the gym at the same days at the same times. You're just doing something different for now until you can get back to the original habit. So I think keeping as many cues as possible that are related to the behavior you had intact is a really good idea to be able to jump back into that habit once you're, healed, or whatever the issue is that's resolved.
Yeah, I think that's we've used the term inertia. And I think like momentum is really what we're trying to accomplish here, if we want to stick with this kind of physics term. And like if we kind of keep with this analogy, which I think is actually really accurate, that once you get this ball rolling, it's therefore easier to push. Yeah. Now that it's already moving, it has less mass that you have to overcome. So the injury that we're talking about is the stopping of the momentum potentially. But like you said, if the actual habit, if like the biggest barrier, and most people know this, is actually being in the right place at the right time.
Right.
Having your gym clothes, being in the gym, you're probably not going to get back in your car and drive home.
Right.
And yeah, if you got a sprained ankle, you do some chest press, or like you said, you could even hang out and focus on technical skills or whatever the sport specific analogy is. I really like that. And I think the way I like to frame it sometimes, because I know a lot of people, it's a tough one, because we can't predict us at our worst, and we don't like to. That's just uncomfortable to think of myself as, a lazy person or whatever. And especially when it's wrapped up into our identity as an athlete or a fitness or an exerciser person. And also because we want to build self-efficacy. The way I like to frame it, instead of going, hey, let me take you at your most motivated right now and hold you back and frustrate you,
right?
Which, is to instead say, you know what, you're going to earn more goals. You're going to earn more things to do. So like, hey, yeah, if you crush having a vegetable or a piece of fruit with every meal, you know what, then we'll start focusing on protein and we go from there. And I think that not only prevents the bar from being set too high, so that on a bad day it all just falls apart and you got to reinvigorate that momentum. But it also gives you that kind of, that thumbs up, that like button, that endorphin rush each time you successfully do one of these things. Like, fuck yeah, crush that first goal, and you can get on to the next one, and the next
There's
one.
a reason that
and it builds,
video games levels are so prevalent. People love that. They love bite-sized achievements and rewards.
Yeah, and I think you can use that to your advantage. And I think we've seen sometimes the consequence in individual sports where there aren't enough of these things. Like we've talked about this before in Iron Culture, where people as adults, sometimes middle-aged adults, get into a sport. It's an individual sport, so there's no one to share the loads and the ups and the downs with. And you can enter anything that doesn't have a qualifier. Like I think bodybuilding is the best example. You can enter a show with the best people in your state, pretty much in most cases, at least at the amateur level. And no other sport, very few other sports are like that. So having like regionals or local comps and all that's not really there. So you have to kind of self-create it. And I think people get burned out because they start really being interested in lifting. Like, for example, with weightlifting, I start, and the first thing I'm looking at is hook grip. Like, how is watching Liu Xiaojin lift going to motivate me? It's cool. It's interesting. But it certainly makes me feel inadequate sometimes as well. And I think the ability to have all these small goals in front of you is something that is not there in some of the sports that we love and some of the lifting disciplines, that is just part and parcel of how we help people make lifestyle change. And I think there's something to be said for that, to kind of look back at, it's not like you have a 13-year-old gymnast. Gymnast is a bad example because they actually competed at very high level at 13. It's not like you have a 13-year-old basketball player who's like, why am I not LeBron right now? Right. But we do that all the time in powerlifting with relative training age.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say that Dr. Mel did something deadly by introducing a video game analogy because I love it. But I would say recently, actually, just an interesting tangent that will be related to what we're talking about. But there's been some video games, because essentially some of them, unfortunately, have become power trips. And when you have, and people don't enjoy it any longer, a certain segment of people that crave kind of complexity or sense of accomplishment when they do things, when everything's given to you and essentially it's a roller coaster ride. So instead of an RPG with a planned leveling system, you just get everything given to you right out of the gate. And that's why there's certain games such as Dark Souls, the Soul series, which I'm a huge fan of, that essentially they purposely gate different experiences. So they actually limit. There's multiplayer, but you can't communicate verbally with the other person. So they actually increase barriers that increase the complexity, but then everything that you accomplish, it feels that your effort actually had some sort of reward. But the RPG leveling system, it's funny that you mentioned that, because someone that was a video game designer that went to Fortis, the exact analogy, I wasn't training him, but I was just giving him some advice, where he's kind of what Eric said, like immediately he wanted to do powerlifting, and where does he go? Like kind of the hook rip. He wants to look at the champions, right? Like the best of the best. And I said, dude, it's like this. You're kind of a level 1 right now. And it's like, he was asking me about belts and, knee sleeves. I'm like, this is kind of like your equipment in an RPG, where you have to have a certain level of proficiency before you're allowed to use it, because you have to demonstrate, Yeah, and immediately as soon as I started explaining it like that, it went from this weird kind of, not that nothing made sense, but it's like, I'm here, where the hell did I go? It's like, oh, I got it. Okay, so like I'm a level 1. And it's like, yeah, like once you squat a plate, like you're like a level 5, or like 2 plates on the squat, like you're a level 10. And once you reach whatever that barrier, that threshold, you unlock a knee sleeve. Like you're allowed, because yeah, you thought, or the belt. It's like once you've learned about intra-abdominal pressure, that usually comes with this point in time. So kind of how you frame a goal, and I love the bite-sized steps that you've been talking about for people that are achievable, and also sort of what you said, when you're at your most humbled as opposed to when you're at your most cocky is a really cool concept that I think could apply for a lot of people, because naturally, I mean, Eric, you could testify to this. Guys don't have egos. Like we don't let our egos dictate any of our choices ever. We're cool heads all the time.
Well, I'll just say this, Omar. I'm the best at not having an ego. Yeah. I just know that, like, if we were to get a bunch of other dudes in a room and we had to, make a case for who has the least amount of ego, I would crush that shit and no one could touch me.
Yeah. I just love that we're the most humble people that I know personally.
Full stop.
Full stop. Yeah. So we have now spoken about overcoming that inertia, starting that habit formation, getting on that groove, getting on my shit. And I'm not asking this just for myself. I'm asking this just for myself. But let's talk about the intention gap then. Let's talk about from starting out to trying to accomplish what your larger goals are, because we could break it down into different segments. So you have your initial goals, and then as you achieve them, new goals become unlocked, right? You start thinking of new vistas, new horizons, even the way you frame things. I think of the fitness journey that we're on. Few people, I mean, maybe now in the time of social media, they would start lifting. It's like, I want to be a world champion. Like when Eric and I started lifting, it's like, I kind of just want to look good. Like, your goals change over time. And as your competence, once again, as you are more capable, it unlocks new areas. So let's talk about kind of the concept of the intention gap for those that are progressing from maybe the beginner stage of their journey towards the middle road, or the intermediate towards maybe at the end, mastery. What are some of these pitfalls that occur with people where, again, they had some of the habits, they're doing well, but from where they want to go, there's just something that happens. There's a multitude of factors that come together in order to make it not happen.
Well, I think part of it is just in the development of those habits. First of all, because once, like we talked about, once the habits are developed, there's less willpower, less sort of energy resources are needed to make yourself do the things. But then I think also, as we kind of started to get into a couple minutes ago, preparing for obstacles. So having like a plan, because no one, especially if you have a long-term goal, right? Let's say you started lifting, you want to be a world champion, but you're a smart guy and you're chunking it down and you're like, first, my goal is to like hit these personal PRs. And then I'm going to, take some time off and do some massing and gain some muscle mass. And then I'm going to go through this cycle and do, you have a nice stepwise plan to get to your very long-term, very large goal, right? Once you've got your habits set up and you're kind of working towards it and everything's falling in line, there's no way you're going to get all the way to your goal or as close as you're going to get to it without running into some serious obstacles like injuries or, like a life tragedy or something that'll get in the way. So having sort of the second layer after learning how to set up habits and start getting in new habits is having good plans. So what we call implementation intentions, which are, if this happens, I will do this. This is the kind of thing that you oddly just need to say out loud or write down, and that actually makes it work better, according to science, which sounds silly and cheesy, but the data suggests it's true. And having just backup plans for any big catastrophe that might happen, like how will I stay as close to on track towards my goal as possible when those things come up.
So having these contingencies, if you will, these if-then statements based on what your potential obstacles could be. Yeah. I think, I don't know about you two, but I know for me, acknowledging there's some kind of internal visceral like denial. Like I don't even want to consider the possibility that I could get derailed. Like it's maybe a statement about me, or maybe it's just scary. The idea that I could get hurt, or, something might happen that could derail me. So I think some people almost see it as a defeatist attitude, whether it's explicitly stated that way or implicit, for them to actually identify potential barriers, potential obstacles, and how they could fall off the horse. And I know that might be a tough sell for people, but I think if you really think about it, it's more completely committing to your goal, acknowledging that, you know, no matter what, I'm going to get there. You're actually now acknowledging what is no matter what.
Yeah, what
That's
are
not
those
just
what's?
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are the whats? That's I think, what you got to think about. Yeah. Another thing I think you said that has a lot of value is you've framed twice now, you've framed willpower as a resource or as something to use, but something that you don't want to use all the time. And that kind of reminds me of the, which I've talked about before in Iron Culture, the competence, the competence consciousness model of skill development. So we go from unconsciously not even knowing why we're doing something wrong or that it could be done right, to then doing it wrong and knowing that we're doing it wrong. That's the frustration phase. And then consciously doing it correctly. And then eventually the goal is to do it correctly unconsciously.
Right.
And the idea there is that you're no longer having to exert mental effort to do something properly. And I would curious to hear your thoughts on that. But I think that's the same thing we're trying to accomplish with all of our habits, right? I mean, I don't necessarily think about the fact that I get a serving of fruit and vegetables or protein at each meal. I don't necessarily have to think about, you know, that I'm getting to sleep at a regular time. I have a lot of just built-ins that are just the way I live my life. And I think just like someone doesn't have to exert, you know, willpower to decide to brush their teeth because they've been doing it since they were 2 or 3 or whatever. I think whenever teeth grow, I don't know. What am I, a dentist? I don't know. So I think that's kind of where you want to get to with your fitness goals. And I know that we have very much a kind of a cognitive bias in the kind of the scientific community where we're like, I want to think about this and this and this, and I want to optimize all these things. And we want to know all the information, but it actually becomes this huge overload of things that you can't possibly implement. And if you can, it requires an incredible amount of focus, attention, stress, and to do so. And you're more often, it's more likely that you're unable to understand all the concepts and miss some second or third order effects. So I guess what I'm asking is how does one go about getting to that fourth stage? If energy is a resource and if it's something that's finite and we shouldn't use it all the time, then what does that look like? What do we manipulate to try to get in that position?
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of an argument in the literature about whether or not willpower is finite. And there's one camp that says, you know, it's finite, it's genetically determined, and you can't change it. Like, you're either going to have willpower or you're not. And there's another camp that says, you know, you can train it and you can get better. And I think it's probably somewhere in between. I think it's probably something like strength, like you might have a genetic predisposition or a genetic ceiling, but you can increase it with training. So I think willpower is kind of a similar thing. But going back also to the making those backup plans, like let's say all of your new habits, all of your new behaviors are requiring, they haven't become habits yet, they're requiring all of your willpower, right? And then you have, you know, your house catches on fire and your insurance doesn't cover it all and you have to take a second job. And now your like levels of stress and the amount of extra energy and just sort of cognitive reserve for dealing with all of this stuff has been diminished. So if you're maxing out your willpower to complete all of your needed behaviors, any obstacle that comes in your path is going to derail everything. So I think that using willpower, getting to that place where willpower is not the thing that's getting you to do your important behaviors, is really critical for making those behaviors sustainable and the goal achievable, because it's unlikely things will be perfect. Other things in your life are going to require those resources.
Right. So I'm guessing what that might look like if I can either have the perspective of it's me against the world and I'm going to willpower through everything, or if I have the perspective of, hey, you know, my world is actually a little microcosm. You know, my environment, I have a lot of control over. You know, I can decide who my friends are, how much time I spend on social media.
Yeah.
Do I set up calendar reminders so I actually get things done?
Yeah.
You know, like, so
that's another thing. Actually, finish and then I have.
Yeah. So it sounds like we're going to say the same thing, but I feel like, all right, so if we accept that willpower may be a trainable trait, whether that's grit or whatever, or just perspective, but that we may or may not always be able to exert it sufficiently to achieve something.
Yeah.
I think that's what both camps would agree with.
Right.
Is that, all right, well then how do I set up my world, my experience, such that I don't have to rely on it? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think a couple of important things aside from what we've already talked about are awareness and ownership. So I think figuring out, if you're not aware of what derails you, if you're not aware of what sets you down the path towards unwanted behaviors, then it's going to be very difficult to either plan ahead and prevent that, or to deal with those instances when they come up. So being aware of the things that derail you and having those plans to deal with those things, and then ownership, just acknowledging that the mistakes that you make and the sort of off-plan things that you do are your fault, and not doing any external blaming, just everything's your fault, good and bad. That means you get to own all your successes, but that also means you need to figure out how to prevent all of your failures from happening again. I think those are things that contribute a lot to that. And I had one more thing in my list, and it's slipped out of my mind now, but I'll come back in just a second. Oh, logging. So logging and tracking things, even tracking not just how you're getting better, but how you're getting less worse, if that makes sense. So if you like, I've had some clients who have the thing where they eat off meal on Friday and then they just let the weekend go and binge all weekend, right? So if you decide you want to stop that behavior, then just eliminating it is unlikely. But if you say, hey, I'm going to binge next time this happens, I'm going to binge only through Saturday, and I'm not going to binge on Sunday. And then the next time you're like, only that meal and the one after, once Friday night ends, I'm done with the binging. And if you can track that progress, you will be able to own that success, even though it doesn't feel like a success, right? You're still doing the bad behavior. You're still failing to some extent, but you're failing less. And if you can track the decrease in failure, then you can get those little rewards or those level up sort of things, like, oh, now I only binge for a couple hours when I make a mistake instead of the whole weekend. And eventually you can get to your asymptote for your behavior.
Oh man, there's some underlying, I think, psychology there that I think a lot of iron gamers deal with that I really like. So I'm reading a book right now called Muscletown, and it's basically the story of Bob Hoffman, who started York Barbell. And it's a cool story, and you got to give him respect regardless of some aspects of his personality, because we wouldn't have the weightlifting culture we have today without him doing his thing over at York. But he was also like comically egotistical. Like some of the like he would literally set up impromptu competitions where he would compete against lightweight class lifters and then like claim victory. And he would write like editorials about himself under a pseudonym, giving himself praise, and everyone knew it. Like all kinds of the stuff that it's just like he's almost like the original cultural meme of the ego-driven but inner insecure, meathead, right? And did a lot of great things. So no offense to Bob Hoffman fans. I am one as well. I just kind of a fan of everything. So anyway, I think one thing that I see a lot of bodybuilders struggle with, because sometimes they have that kind of element of this ego to protect this insecurity on the inside, is they're not really good at owning their failures. I think, how often do you hear backstage at a bodybuilding show, and this is kind of a question to everybody, when someone gets a bad placing and they blame it on politics, judging, the subjective nature of the sport, I messed up my peak, or something that is external.
Right.
And these come out of the other side of the mouth of the same person who is normally all about like extreme ownership and preaching about how you've got to want it. It's got to be all from you. You've got to overcome your thing. And it's kind of this dichotomy where it's like, yeah, if it's all on your shoulders and you're a rugged individualist and you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that gives you a lot of power. That's great. That builds self-efficacy. But when you fail and then you say, oh man, that's some external factor.
Yeah.
Exactly. Initially, it feels great because now you're not a failure, right? It's these shitty judges, it's the subjective nature of the sport or it's whatever. But what you're really doing is at every opportunity to figure out why you failed and what you can do better, you're saying, I have no control over this.
Right.
And when you give away control, you give away the power to change. Exactly. And I think that is why I think weightlifting is great for people with insecurities and this kind of ego balance, because it constantly gives you that opportunity. Like Omar, the example you gave of the guy who was like, the record's mine, and then misses it mid-lift. That's some cognitive dissonance you can't look away from. Yeah. It's happening right now, So yeah, I just found that an interesting observation.
I do think male egos are big enough to completely obfuscate that, though. It's like he probably still thought the record was his after that failure attempt. Like you would think you have that come to Jesus moment, like, you know what, I don't. It clearly just indicated you. I mean, I have so many stories just because due to Fortis Fitness, the gym that I go to, and having the opportunity to interact with some of the, let's say, higher end lifters competing at a world level, where there's individuals that aren't quite there. Myself and Mike, my buddy Sam, Mike, kind of joke about them, like people that aren't quite elite, but they aspire to be elite, and it's kind of, it mystifies them, that process. But they have, it's kind of the Dunning-Kruger, where they believe they're at a certain point where they can achieve it, and just it's a dangerous place to be, because if you don't fix some of those things, you'll never get better. And another guy wanted to go after my buddy Jeremy Hamilton, his record, and he was 2 weight classes above Jeremy. He was 300 pounds less than his total. Like, he was so far away, but he thought he was close. And one time at the gym, he almost died because he was doing a reverse grip bench press, and he decided to lose the safeties because the way he was bringing it down, like whatever. And his friend was spotting him. He was going for like a rep max, and his friend was a twig. And his friend was like rowing it up, and then he couldn't row it up. And then the guy went to bring it back down. It was stuck on his chest. Ego didn't want to call for help. The gym was relatively full. There's enough people. Hey, his friend was there, and he paused, and I saw from far away. I started like moving towards him because I'm like, even though I don't like this individual, I don't want to see someone die. And what he did, I'm not making this up, and people at Fortis can back me up that were there that day, is that he basically pressed it and pushed it behind his head, behind the bench press, and sneaked underneath it with 365 pounds. So rather than call for help, he risked his own life, because if at any moment the bar just, descended, he would be done. And it was actually a Herculean feat in order to lift it off. So, we talk about habit formation. I'm just here to present you guys with a, alternate take, the ultimate willpower hero. And we know how it worked out. He ended up being a world champion. Or he quit the gym 3 months later. I mean, I don't know. I do think those conversations are relevant to some of our audience. And I do think it's specific. Certain conversations that are had apply to different types of lifter. You kind of have the so-called neurotic lifter that might overthink things, and they're their own worst enemy in one way, where they limit themselves from achieving what they can. And then in other ways, like kind of the super ego-driven lifter, it's another way entirely, where there's that gap, there's a chasm between their actual ability and where they see themselves. And rather than when they fail, as you said, Dr. Mel, it's like, that's kind of like they continue to fail, and what's going to happen? They're gonna understand that once again that maybe something needs to be changed. It's like, oh no, I gotta just lump on that willpower. Like, nope, I just didn't believe hard enough. I'm like, oh. So I do think the iron in general, what I like about it, kind of what Eric was saying with weightlifting, is that because there are those objective numbers, you're kind of testing yourself against a known format. So in bodybuilding, not the argument, and Eric, you could correct me, it's like there's a subjectivity. There are some absolute numbers though. Like if you come on stage at like 18% body fat and you're surprised that you don't place, like that's kind of a shock. But
well, if you're a female and you're in the bikini division, sure, that's a pretty reasonable body fat percentage. That's totally fine.
No, that actually makes complete sense. But I'm speaking as adult male, the River City Royal Rumble 2019. If you stepped on those hallowed grounds against Eric, he would have said, "You want none of this." I hate to bring this up, Eric, but I have to. Eric won, of course, because he's a champion. But it wasn't him winning; it's what he did afterwards, where he gloated in everyone's face and said, again, he said, "You don't want none of that." Like, you think Eric would go up and say, "Hey, like, awesome job," and like, what I know, Eric, but he was just dunking on their face in person. It was unreal.
I'm just gonna go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and just take a second, since I have seen people follow another fitness podcast, Stronger by Science, and not get their level of sarcasm. That's not true at all.
No, it's not true. No.
All right.
No. That's why it's so funny to joke about for me. Like with Eric, because it's so uncharacteristic of Eric. Eric's like, "Way to go, brother. Hey man, you look great." Like, even, hey, I'm just going to say it objectively, or try, I mean, with my own opinion, that you were complimenting everyone, bro. Like, you were there to lift people up.
That's what we do here at Iron Culture. We lift people up when we're not making jokes. So.
Yeah. which is a continuous thing.
A similar dynamic. Well, maybe it's not similar, but there's those factors play into jiu-jitsu a lot too. I think jiu-jitsu is one of those interesting ones where it is quantitative in that you can win on points if you don't submit, but there is some subjectivity because refs have to make decisions about who gets advantages, who gets penalties, and all these sort of minor things that when the points are tied, they make the difference. Or, sometimes last match for me in Pans, I was in the finals and it was 0-0 to the end, and I literally had no idea who would win until they raised her hand. And neither of us knew why, and we both talked about it after. We're like, we don't know why. They must have just, she was playing top, I was playing bottom. Maybe they think they prefer top, or maybe they thought, she threatened more. It's hard to tell from the outside. So there is a level where confidence can really get you far. Like, you'll see people win matches that they shouldn't win because they do not have the technical prowess of their competitor, but they just believe so much that they make crazy things happen, Right. And I think there's a line to walk there, because I think if you don't have confidence, if you don't believe in yourself, particularly in combat sports, there's a psychological aspect. It's going to be hard to achieve your goals, but you have to be able to believe in yourself and still have the ability to take ownership of failures. Otherwise, you don't get very far just on belief and willpower.
And I think that's a really good juxtaposition to the difference between egocentrism and what I talked about, having an inner security, which is technically narcissism, if we really want to talk about that. And confidence is that the narcissist or the egocentric person who doesn't own their failures can't look at their failures because it is speaking to the insecurity. They think that's the real them. Yeah. So how could they ever plan for something that scares them of their own self-identity? Yeah, exactly. It's an existential crisis for them to try to think about that and plan for it. While someone with true confidence, they have the belief in themselves that even in the face of failure, they will eventually come back. Right. I can overcome this too. And I think that is so important, but that only comes from facing that kind of that fear in yourself and seeing that you can overcome it. And that's so much of what we're talking about, this whole idea of building momentum. And getting that inertia going, is that all those progressively less low-hanging fruit eventually leads to you looking up and you're standing on top of the tree. Right. That was an analogy, folks. And
I just pictured those goats in the trees.
Yes, exactly. Those goats who are climbing on top of trees, getting on top of mountains, they have confidence, true confidence. I would even say they might be the greatest of all time.
We've gone episodes without a joke like that. Episodes.
Sorry. I bring out those jokes in people, I think. I'm
proud of myself.
Eric's like, you know what? And my confidence won't allow me to be shattered, my ego, by your petty remarks, Omar. I knew it was a great joke.
Yeah, I know it was a great joke. I don't need anyone else's external validation. That's the way humor works. You only need to think it's funny by yourself. So, Mel, I think one other thing that comes to mind when we talk about not having to rely on willpower except when needed is manipulating your environment. And I know for me personally, I think that has been a really big part of my success. Like, there's a big difference between having, and I feel bad for someone who lives in a family or a roommate situation, people with very, very different goals. Like, if you have an entire cabinet full of chocolates and high energy processed foods and hyper palatable foods, and you're trying to follow like a prep diet or just a healthy diet in general, or like just an auto-regulated diet that results in less food intake, so you're eating a lot of fruits, vegetables, fiber, and protein, that's hard to do. But if all you do is you go to the grocery store and you buy like egg whites, tuna, Greek yogurt, fruits and veggies, like how bad can you mess up? Like, I had a binge on egg whites, bro. And I think that's just one example, but I'd love to hear more examples and practical application of how changing your environment so you don't have to leverage willpower can be used, so that someone listening might have some ideas.
Yeah, I think definitely, like you said, if you have the control, keeping foods, if you're on a diet, whatever it is, keeping foods that will derail you out of the house, doing things like having a wind down. I think a lot of people sort of underestimate how important sleep and recovery are in any kind of fitness goal. Having like a wind down routine before bed, making sure you get enough sleep, so that there's been studies that show when you're sleep deprived, your willpower is not as strong. So anything that still needs willpower, even just like sticking to newer habits that aren't fully formed yet, is going to be harder if you're not getting enough sleep. So structuring, like, or if you work out, I used to do this when I still worked in the lab. I would go from home to jujitsu, shower at the lab, go to jujitsu afterwards, and then go home. And so I would have to have, like 2 gis, all of my food, showering stuff, clothes for lab, all packed with me by, 5:30 in the morning. So if I got up to do that in the morning, like, the chances that I would get all of the stuff ready correctly were really small. So on the weekend, I would pack multiple jujitsu bags. So this would be like Monday's bag with 2 gis and like a protein shake with no water in it yet. And I would set those out so that when I got up on Monday, I just picked that thing up and grabbed, whatever prepped food I had out of the fridge and went through my day. So having things set up to make it as easy as possible for you because the point that you mess up a habit is right when you have the choice. So when it's not, even things like if someone's trying to diet and they're not quite there yet, you offer them a food. If they train themselves to wait and answer the question a minute later, they usually make a better choice. So it's that sudden choice, that snap decision, that you want to avoid making it easier to do the wrong thing. So if you can set yourself up so that when you can make that snap decision, the easier thing to do is the right thing, that can go a long way towards keeping you on track, I think.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Like, decision fatigue is something I think everyone can relate to just in life in general.
Yeah.
And then imagine you've also got like hunger or tiredness or fatigue or whatever, like something else. But yeah, like if you're in the lab and your gym bag's in the back of your seat and the gym's 10 minutes away, you're probably going to drive to the gym, But if you have to go the other direction for 10 minutes, go home, change, get back in the car, then go, you might just change into your sweatpants and hang out on the couch.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to circle back to, which you said, which I really like, and this also comes to something that some of the more ego-driven lifters are going to struggle with, is that you said getting better at being like less worse, and then celebrating that, reframing it, and like planning to do something is quote unquote bad, but to just make it a part of the plan rather than saying it will never happen. I think this reminds me of like diet breaks and refeeds. The original research on diet breaks was people trying to study exactly what we're talking about. Nutrition researchers, Wing and Jeffries back in 2002, I believe, or maybe 2005. I can't remember. But they wanted to look at, all right, they're fine following a diet for a fixed amount of time. When they fall off the wagon and they can't rebuild that momentum and inertia, that's the problem. Yeah. So why don't we have people on these diets, and then we purposely tell them to go off the diet. Don't go to the weight loss group. Don't check in. Don't try to lose weight. And interestingly enough, it didn't actually derail them like real diet breaks or diet, like a break of a diet, I should say, which like is something that you don't plan for. Exactly, 100%. The way I like to say it, because it's immediately absurd and people get it, is it better to change the oil in your car proactively or reactively? Do you wait until your car breaks down and then you change the oil? And that's exactly what everyone responds. They laugh because it's ridiculous. But we do that all the time with fitness, right? We don't acknowledge the possibility that we could fail. We think, here's a bad habit that I know I like to do, and probably has other benefits, like just keeping me psychologically sane, etc. But it doesn't fit with my current goals, so I'm just going to not do it. What's the strategy? Well, I'm going to not do it. That's not a strategy, right? But saying, okay, I normally go out to eat on weekends, so maybe I'm going to create a deficit that's there on weekdays, and instead of just having that unplanned, just making that little black box and then wondering why I failed, I put some structure on it. It's one cheat meal. I go here, or like you said, you create some planned inclusion of what would normally just be seen as a negative behavior. And I think that's a tough one, because you have to acknowledge A, that you have negative behaviors, and then B, you have to accept that and say it's okay. And then finally, you have to, for the more neurotic people you talked about, Omar, like who want to do everything optimally, you have to accept that your plan to get to a goal is at face value not optimal, and then that kind of turns the whole thing on its head. So I think, man, I think it really highlights the power of reframing and just the necessity of being very honest with yourself.
Yeah. And I think also things like creating a system like that maybe on paper, according to the science, isn't absolutely optimal in terms of your calorie intake for your goals or your fat loss diet, but is optimal for your adherence, because if you stick to a slightly suboptimal diet 100%, that's going to be a lot better than not sticking to a completely optimal diet. And I think people get caught up in the details and the science and forget that the adherence is that all important factor that sort of comes above everything else.
Yeah. I've often said that when it comes to diet and whatnot, we should try and create models that accurately predict humans as they will be, not as we hope them to be. Same thing applies for ourselves, right? Where it's like what am I actually going to do versus what would be, in quotations, ideal. I do think there is something interesting to be said about the concept of min-maxing. I am going to make another Dark Souls reference because, yeah, we already dropped the video game reference. We could go right in. But in video games, there is something called legitimately min-maxing. And what that means in RPG, where the given variables, so you're given all these inputs, and you want to optimize the situation. So if you're going to fight a boss, you're not going to go in with a rusty sword, right? You have different equipment that gets dropped to you. You want to use the best possible things. That doesn't mean, and when it comes to willpower, so the amount of effort you're going to be applying, that you're reducing that. But what it does mean, you're making it as easy as possible to succeed. And I think sometimes the narrative I've seen personally in some lifters' heads is that because they want to accomplish the goal, in quotations, all by themselves. It's almost like this, how do we say, this thing that they want to possess and just feel that it was all willpower. They'll purposely choose not to make things easier because for some reason they think that lessens the accomplishment. So meaning that, I drove, and this is just an example, but I drove 3 hours to get to the gym. It's like, that is fantastic. And I love that you did that. It's like, and if you like that environment and that's the gym for you, that's super cool. Also, you belong to a Good Life, which is a chain, and you have 10 minutes down the road. Like, wouldn't you choose the one that's closer to where you are? It's like, same idea in terms of all the potential things that could trip you up on your journey. It's like, well, why not kind of remove these? Or, hey, this social situation, I don't think I'm going to act maybe in the best possible state of mind. Maybe avoid that. Or like, what are the things when Eric said about setting up the calories? It's like, really, I think the true way to progress is to optimize your environment. And remember Brian Whitaker, Eric, where what was the phrase that he said before I go on? What was it? He
acts optimal within the constraints of his responsibilities because he puts life, career, his family, and his spirituality above bodybuilding. Yeah. So those are the constraints, and then he optimizes within that.
Yeah. No, I think it's exactly that he understood. And I think that's a part of the reason why, besides them genetics and everything else, is that he's a champion, is that he recognized that, you know what, I have to take a look at what I can do. And then when I want to get that nitro feel, like when I want to up the intensity, so now I've made it as easy as possible for me to try and excel. Let me go ahead and do my thing, as opposed to kind of not the reverse, but the individual. It's like, it's all hard. Like, here I go again. It's like, why? Like, you haven't warmed up before you've done this lift. Like, you actually have made this. You've reduced your chances of success by letting your ego get in the way because you want to somehow claim it was all you. And I see that as, because we're talking specifically now about lifters, how they trip themselves up. There's a whole contingent of lifters that I would classify in that category.
Yeah, I think that's the prevalent fallacy on a bunch of different levels of fitness too. The hard means good or better. Just even in less educated people designing fitness programs, like, just make it hard, and then the people think that it's good training. So whenever anything is hard, whenever anyone has done anything hard, it's kind of glorified and valued above doing it right or better even.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was said
any trainer can make you throw up.
Right.
That's not necessarily useful. And man, with someone who's not into fitness, that's probably going to make sure they don't show up for their next session.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to make the terrible joke, and I'm just going to make it, and Eric's going to chastise me. It takes any trainer can make any client throw up, but it takes a really skilled trainer to make them develop an eating disorder. Like that level of just malpractice, really it takes a certain skill set that I think is unique to some individuals.
You got to know when to turn the shame dial. You got to know when to give them the opportunity to fail and then encourage it, but then punish them afterwards. And also the small, subtle comments about their body are also really, really key. You know, get them to be like, hey, I found this. I got this really good gym clothes here, and you bring them like 2 sizes too small, right. And then when they try it on, you go, I'm really surprised it didn't fit you. Anyway, I'm sure you're training on your own quite well, and then you just move along.
Yeah. And that's how you keep them forever as a client. I mean, if anyone wants to listen to the episode that we had with Jordan Syatt, where we spoke about how not to be a terrible personal trainer, that's one of the key. You want to keep clients forever. And we, around here, Dr. Mel, I don't know if you agree, we like to go with the dependency model. So the idea that they'll never be competent on their own because we are, in fact, everything that they need.
It's never explain the reasons for anything.
Oh, we'll tell them why they're not succeeding. It's because of their own failures, their ineptitude. Yeah.
Yeah, you went to the gym on your own and you probably did everything wrong. So just need to have a 4th session with me every week. Hashtag job security. We're good.
My. You know what's so sad, Eric? Like we joke, see, Dr. Mo, we've been in this field for so long, is that we have seen these things and we're not even, Eric, we're not far off the mark. Like all these remarks that we say, a lot of things that we joke about, it's actually, the sad part is how true it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why it's unfortunately funny. Oh,
yeah.
So I know we've jumped around a good bit, and that's because Omar and I are such great hosts with a clear, logical progression through a topic that we like to use. I would love it if maybe we kind of circle back, and if you were going to give someone who's maybe a little more structured in their thinking than Omar and I, some of kind of like the key summary main points of here's what you can do to make that gap we've been talking about easier to overcome, and some of the primary steps for establishing a new habit or changing a behavior that you previously didn't want, or maybe both. You could do both or either one.
Yeah, so I think the very first step is identifying your goal very specifically, not just broadly, like I want to be huge. That's not a specific goal. Like how much do you want to gain? How much more do you want to lift? Get the specific goal and then sit down and write down what it will likely take to achieve that goal. Decide whether that's reasonable and adjust the goal accordingly. Do this when you're not in your best, happiest, most relaxed state, when you're a little run down and tired and you are a little more realistic. Then start identifying what habits you currently have that are going to get in the way of progressing towards that goal, and think about ways that you can alter those. What can you do? You drink 2 beers every night, but you want to lose fat. Can you replace those beers with cups of tea and only have a beer on Friday, or track, the reduction in how many beers you drink over time until you get to no beers and then start your diet kind of thing. And then once you begin to work on changing the habits that are in your way, make sure you're tracking your progress towards being less bad, right? So make sure you're tracking how much better you're getting at not doing the things you don't want to do, so that you can, even though you haven't gotten to the goal where you're actually on the fat loss diet and losing fat, you are able to reward yourself for the progress you're making in setting up stable habits that will support that goal in the future. And then as you're working towards changing those habits, develop your sort of implementation intentions and coping plans for obstacles. Get your, gym clothes ready, put them in the car with a note to yourself, like, go to the gym today. Write down, track how often you go to the gym, make sure you're staying on point or at least getting better over time. Decide what you're going to tell your family when they don't want you to go to the gym when you visit them, or they want you to eat grandma's casserole or whatever it is. Plan around that what your response will be. Oh, grandma, I'll put the casserole in the freezer. I can't wait to eat this after my diet's over. Whatever it is that will allow you to maintain your social interactions and the rest of the important parts of your life without altering your plan. And making sure along the way that you're taking ownership of all of those successes and also of all of the failures, and every time you fail, asking yourself, what triggered this? What was the cue? What was the context? And how can I alter my behavior in the future to deal with the same context when it shows up again? Because in all likelihood, I'll make the same mistake if I don't plan for it, because cues mediate behavior very much. That's basic plan.
I love it. I think that's really helpful, because that gives people some very, very clear-cut things. I have a question. It's more of an academic question, and I don't know how well easy it is to quantify some of these things. But I know there is a fair amount of research on a lot of the topics you discussed, and sometimes, different strategies in isolation or in combination. Could you give us a general, maybe, perspective on how much more effective that might be than just simply going out there and trying to do things? Like what research is there on these habit-based strategies that suggest how effective they can be?
There's a lot of research, but I think, like you said, it's a really difficult thing to quantify. Just that most of the strategies I've talked about have been shown in research studies to make it significantly more likely that the person adheres to the plan. So putting down percentages is hard because, something like flossing every night versus becoming a bodybuilder are two different, broad categories that you could call goals, and they take a little more or less work depending on which one. And I think that it's also hard to quantify even if you get exact percentages for a specific behavior, because you'll have subjects who vary in their previous exposure to this type of thing. They'll vary in their sort of baseline willpower going in. So even if you have a percentage, it's hard to apply that to an individual just because there's so many variables that affect how well you'll be able to add a given behavior to your life. But it's definitely, these things have been shown to significantly increase chances. A couple other things are, social support. We sort of touched on that, and self-identity. I think that's a fun one. We kind of touched on that too, just making sure not to consistently identify yourself as something you don't want to be or want to change, because it will inhibit your progress, which seems touchy-feely and weird, but it has been shown in literature to be the case. So
I think it makes total sense, touchy-feely or not. I've heard humans have emotions. I don't. I'm just a bodybuilder.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of people who are say, well, I'm an all, the funny thing is we allow the identities that we think align with the identity we already have, right? So and if we don't see it necessarily as a negative, we might be more willing to state it. I can't tell you how many times I've had athletes or bodybuilders say, look, I'm just an all or nothing person. And that is an interesting double-edged sword for sport. It gives you, like you said, we don't always want to use willpower, but when you whip it out, that's actually a pretty effective tool, and you can really put it down. Of course, there's the pendulum swinging back, causing issues. But when you can point out to someone, being all or nothing is actually quite problematic. Your goal might take 10 years. We need to have some moderation over time. And then I think I've even had bodybuilders who their whole self-identity is based around, I have the power to change myself. I can do anything to achieve a goal. I'm in control of myself. But when I tell them that they need to be less extreme, then they have this kind of crisis of identity. Like, oh shit, So it happens to anybody. And I think that if we were to look at what is the definition of self-efficacy, and also having someone who has a an intrinsic locus of control versus an extrinsic locus of control, it's saying, does the world happen to me, or do I have some agency? It's really just about having agency, right?
Yeah.
So if you identify something negative that is preventing you from getting there, and that's just who I am, and identity, if you see that as a fixed concept, then that is always going to be the barrier that you can't change. And it may be sometimes it doesn't have much ability to change. There are some qualities of us that maybe we don't have as much adaptive capacity in. And then you can actually identify that and do something about it. But for something that perhaps could change, but you identify as it not being able to change, I could see that being a consistent barrier for someone. So that totally makes sense to me. So, one more.
Yeah.
Anything you wanted to say?
No, I was just going to say, my biggest problem is just being the hardest worker in the room. It's just tough always.
If I had to list my negative character traits, it's that I work too hard, Yeah. Classic job interview.
Yeah. I don't get callbacks because they're just intimidated.
100%.
Yeah.
So I think at this point, Mel, what we like to do is we like to open the floor to the guest to make sure, if any in our strangely circuitous tangents that the way we like to host podcasts, if we missed anything, and if there's anything that you want to say to make sure that you think would be ideal for the listener to understand on this topic before we close it out.
I think we ended up covering all of my big points when talking about these things. So I think we did, circuitous or not, we did a pretty good job.
And that's essentially just complimenting yourself, because we definitely fortuitous. Omar and I definitely didn't make sure we covered everything. So you did a great job. So thank you for being on and making sure that we actually did what we're intentioned to do. Still going for that 2.5 star compromise. That is the best compromise between our hosts feeling satisfied and our guests. Right now, we're not doing too great. We're a little too high. We're going to try to bring it down. I hope you've helped us. So on that ridiculous joke note, where can people find more about you and what you do if they want to learn more about this topic or others?
I am on Instagram, where I occasionally post links to other things that I've written. My handle is regressive underload. There's an underscore between the two words. I also work for RP, and I do a lot of writing and editing of the books that RP publishes. So if you check out their bookstore, there's a bunch of me in there. I'm actually working on a diet psychology kind of habit for kind of along the lines of what we talked about today, a book, but that's probably going to be about a year out. So.
Okay, so sometime early 2021-ish?
That's what we're thinking, yeah.
Awesome. We'll be on the lookout. Make sure you guys check out Renaissance Periodization, where Dr. Mel makes Dr. Israetel seem a little less ridiculous. Kind of brings it down to earth from editing. And yeah, I just want to say thank you very much for being on. I think this is a really important topic. It's probably way more important than the science, because it's kind of like, if you're not entering this door, you're not in the building at all. So yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Renaissance. I just want to thank Dr. Mel for being on and say, Eric, to our credit, this isn't a presentation, the podcast. It's a conversation. And a natural conversation actually goes down many paths. Okay, there are many forks in the road. We are not robots here, okay? We're not here to give a PowerPoint presentation. We're not here to try and regurgitate information. We're living, breathing entities. We can't say the same with some of our contemporaries, And I think that's one of the defining characteristics of Iron Culture, is that we manage to stay human. And I plan on staying human for at least the rest of 2020.
Fair.
And staying defensive, apparently.
Yeah, I'm just saying there might be another podcast as an AI. I don't want to name what it is. And the system needs to be updated with a new, let's say, emotional matrix, because its attempt to try and replicate the human emotions is laughable.
Yeah, I think they got to recalibrate their sarcasmometer on the Knuckles AI 2.3 or whatever it is.
Yeah, another update. But I will say thank you. It's almost like this was spur of the moment and it worked out for the best. So I just want to thank Dr. Mel. We will definitely have in the description all of your contact information. I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. We are doing battle. Dr. Mel, did you know that we're in the health and fitness category of podcasts, and some of our illustrious contemporaries are podcasts such as Sex with Dr. Emily, Sex with Dr. Jess, that routinely actually perform a little bit above us. So if people want to help us out, they can leave a rating review on iTunes. We try and do our best to read them. On YouTube, if you leave a comment, we'll once again do our best to respond. And we're back every single Monday with another episode. We'll catch you then.